Welcome to everyone tonight who's watching, and particularly the panelists who are going to speak to you all in due course. This is a very important event, and I want to indicate, well, obviously who I am. I'm Michael Mansfield. I'm a lawyer. You probably are aware of some of the work that I do, but I'm president of the Haldane Society, who are effectively, in a sense, hosting or facilitating this meeting tonight. I think I want to make it clear that that's what they are, facilitators. In the same way as president, I'm a facilitator tonight as well. And nobody's come to listen to me, they've come to listen to people who've got opinions and views, particularly informed ones, about a study which is, I don't know whether it's published today, but it's certainly being launched today by Verso. It's been put together by the Jewish Voice for Labour, and it's a study entitled How the Equalities and Human Rights Commission Got It So Wrong. Now, the topic being, as many who are watching will realise, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And the importance of today, and why the Haldane in particular have been prepared to facilitate it, is that in fact the original report and its findings are highly questioned, but there has been in fact no real debate, particularly within the Labour Party. It has been virtually prohibited, and that the findings of this original report by the Commission has been directed to be accepted unchallenged, and therefore it has had a detrimental effect on democratic debate and free speech. People have found themselves, as it were, stifled from speaking about perfectly legitimate issues, lest it be embraced by the findings of the Equality Commission report. So the report itself has had immense repercussions for people who are concerned about issues in the Middle East. And of course, those issues are on the forefront of all our minds at this moment as to what is going on there. And although we've come together tonight not to discuss that, but the report, nevertheless, it's the backcloth against which we speak. Now, I've said enough, and I'm going to pause for a second because our first speaker, known to many of you, is in a sense representing and is the voice of the Jewish Voice for Labour, co-chair, Jenny Manson. May I hand over to you? And may I just indicate that as a matter of procedure, the idea is that all the speakers, of which there are at least 5, but there may be some more, 5 speakers all speak in turn, and then after they've spoken, we'll begin a process of allowing questions from anyone who has. Some have been sent in advance, and I've no doubt people will be filling their screens with chat. So, over to Jenny.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everybody. I'm sorry for the rough start, but they always say it'll be a bad rehearsal, wonderful performance. I've just seen a question about Chris Williamson's team. They are going to be represented. Amar Kazmi is going to be speaking later tonight. So our report, as you know, was called How the EHRC Got It So Wrong, Anti-Semitism and the Labour Party, published by Verso, as Michael said, and hosted by Haldane. And it's been a wonderful partnership between ourselves, Verso, and the Haldane. And it was put together, our report, with contributions from many JVL members, and in particular, the EHR team, which we called ourselves, the EHRC team. That's Mike Cushman, Richard Cooper, my co-chair, Leah Levan, and myself. And I want to also thank Naomi Wayne and Geoffrey Bindman here today, and other excellent contributors. And a special thank you to Michael Mansfield for chairing, and to the speakers. Liz Fekete had to fit this meeting in with another one, so she has to leave at 6:45. This is a very somber time, a terrifying escalation of violence, reflecting, I fear, an escalating assault on the rights of Palestinians over decades. It's a strange evening to be discussing the EHRC in a sense, but behind the politics of this evening's discussion has been this attempt to silence knowledgeable critics of Israel's policies and supporters of Palestinian rights, including within Israel itself. And this silencing, happening in so many parts of the world, contributes to the continuation of these unjust policies. So I think tonight's meeting in some ways is very timely, because this attempt to silence critics of Israel, plus the power struggle in the Labour Party reflected in the mainstream media, is the backdrop to what we see as the most protracted, ferocious controversy ever seen within the Labour Party, and it surrounded allegations of Labour anti-Semitism. And this political controversy boiled down to three main claims: that Labour's elected leadership was anti-Semitic, that anti-Semitism had become widespread in the party, and that the party was institutionally anti-Semitic. In July 2019, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, or the EHRC, as you will remember, launched an investigation into these allegations of anti-Semitism in Labour. And right at the beginning, the investigation got off on the wrong foot. Its terms of reference did not, as required by law, specify the unlawful acts suspected. We have the very helpful advice of Sir Geoffrey Bindman here tonight, and he and I questioned the terms of reference, but we got no response. So instead, we played the game and we put in two lengthy submissions. Plus, I personally refuted baseless allegations against me contained in a submission from the Jewish Labour Movement, which JVL attempted to refute allegation by allegation. So the one against me and the ones that we submitted were not recognised in the report, got courteous replies, but that's all that happened. So there's no evidence, as I say, that the EHRC gave any real consideration to the fact that the JLM had called me an anti-Semite. But we know about this. It seems that I'm what's called the wrong sort of Jew. As with my JVL colleagues and other Jewish friends and supporters, the rich history of our individual parents, families and traditions, religious and secular, Zionist and anti-Zionist, and each of our own individual branch of Jewishness apparently count for nothing. We're not heard. So this climate has meant that since 2016, I've experienced discomfort as a Jew in the Labour Party, and I never did before in my membership of 50 years of the party. But the discomfort is not the discomfort that is the media describe, but the discomfort of being treated as an anti-Semitic Jew from some branches of the Labour Party. Well, when the EHRC report was published in October 2020, it was held up as an authoritative vindication of the political allegations against Labour. But what our study shows is this is not actually true. Whatever you think of the HRC report and the HRC and its report, they did not go along with those allegations. To begin with, the reports were far more limited than the political charges against Labour. There were no findings against former leader Jeremy Corbyn, nor any findings that anti-Semitism was widespread in the party, nor that Labour had victimised anyone, nor that the Labour Party had directly discriminated against any member, i.e. treated any member less favourably because of their religion or race. Rather, the HRC determined that two individuals in a party of over 500,000 members, described as agents, had harassed Jews, that Labour did not adequately train its complaints staff, and that Labour officials intervened in politically sensitive complaints. But the EHRC's own findings and other external evidence that leadership intervention favoured anti-Semitic complainants and sped up decision-making. In other words, Jeremy Corbyn and his office were telling the investigators to get on with it. And even the EHRC's limited conclusions are both empirically and legally dubious. For example, its harassment determinations misrepresent evidence and deviate from legal precedent that protects freedom of speech in matters of political controversy, as later this evening Amar Kazmi will explain. he and his team are supporting an attempt to have a judicial review on the findings against Ken Livingstone and Pam Bromley. Plus, the EHRC's decision to consider so-called insufficient anti-Semitism training as a standalone issue automatically absolved it from even having to acknowledge the obvious comparator. There is a complete absence of Islamophobia training. That wasn't even mentioned in the report. And the framework for these findings was fundamentally wrong. And I think the thing that we discovered that's most fundamental and will perhaps surprise you, the EHRC is responsible for oversight of the Equalities Act 2010. In carrying out its so-called investigation into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, the EHRC acted entirely outside its legal brief. It had no right to investigate anti-Semitism. And not only is the meaning of anti-Semitism highly contested, including among us Jews, it's not a legal term. Yet the EHRC repeatedly arbitrated on whether expressions were anti-Semitic, while this was largely not relevant, without defining their own term. But the problem was that the EHRC referred throughout to a monolithic Labour Party. I don't know where it's been this last few years. It talked as if the raging disputes about alleged anti-Semitism, Labour anti-Semitism, never happened. It decided not to examine the evidence underlying the leaked report and blamed Labour's leadership under Jeremy Corbyn for failings that were clearly attributed to his bitter factional opponents. The EHRC also referred to a non-existent entity called the Jewish community. There is no such thing. There are Jewish communities and there are individual Jews with their own idiosyncratic views, but they're Jews. So this deference to the so-called Jewish community obliterated the diversity of Jewish attitudes. And this has endorsed the Jewish leadership's goal of marginalizing and invalidating people like us, dissenting Jewish perspectives. And it played straight into Keir Starmer's leadership, who wants to do the same thing and marginalize us. There's one positive thing the EHRC did. They did some very good work documenting the serious flaws in Labour's complaints process, and they actually noted the especially harsh impact of these flaws on respondents. But then it spoiled its own work by failing to follow up on those particular findings. Since publication, the EHRC report has been mobilised by Keir Starmer's leadership to justify driving out the left and silencing debate within the party. Tonight, and as our report is published by Verso, we hope that this assessment will bring the facts into the daylight and bring back a return to the kind of open discussion in the Labour Party that's the lifeblood of any democratic organisation. So thank you for listening to us all tonight, and back to Michael to introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much, Jenny. The next speaker is very well known to, I think, nearly all of us, Sir Geoffrey Bindman. He's been a colleague of mine for many, many years. He's a visiting professor of law. That won't surprise anybody, at the University College at London and also London South Bank. But I think more particularly, it's important to remember that he has been a legal advisor to the Race Relations Board, and then after that, the Commission for Racial Equality. So very knowledgeable, very experienced. Geoffrey, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I've said, or summarized my views on this matter in the preface that I've written to the report, but no doubt the audience will not have had a chance to read that at this stage. So I will say a little about my approach to this question. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is the successor to the Race Relations Board and the Commission for Racial Equality. And it was established with somewhat wider powers. It was given a general supervisory role over matters of equality covered by the Equality Act, which Jenny Manson has referred to. And it was given limited legal powers. It's not a court of law. but it was given the power in circumstances where it suspected unlawful discrimination or unlawful acts under the Equality Act to conduct investigations. Now, when it makes that decision to conduct an investigation, which gives it some limited legal powers, it has to set out the grounds for its suspicion, which it has not done. As Jenny explained, we asked them to do it and they lied. So to this day, we don't know what it was, what the suspicion was that led them to launch an investigation into illegal acts. And that caused them great difficulty, because once they came to start the investigation, it was pretty clear that there was really no evidence of unlawful acts at all, except by stretching the facts to produce very narrow conclusions of illegal conduct by the Labour Party. But of course, when their report was eventually published, all the publicity was about the illegal behaviour of the Labour Party. It was not about what actually sparked off the whole investigation, which was a series of complaints put forward by two organizations, campaigning organizations, against anti-Semitism. And fine, you know, I have no complaint about bodies campaigning against anti-Semitism, but these bodies also had a strong motivation to support the Israeli government and were clearly involved in support for political questions, which are really quite outside the role and scope of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. However, having made a number of complaints, and in my foreword to the report, I've mentioned the fact that I've quoted from the report, which says that there were 220 cases brought to them by these two organizations. They looked at them, they selected 70 to examine more closely. And they ended up concluding that there were only 2 of those cases which merited a conclusion that there had been unlawful conduct. And they also found that there were, or they claimed that there were cases of indirect unlawful discrimination in the 2 areas that Jenny mentioned, namely the training of people to investigate discrimination cases, and the supposed interference by the leadership in the investigation of complaints. Now, the accuracy or validity of the conclusions reached by the EHRC, and this is one of the reasons why we're here, has not been subjected to any judicial examination or any kind of independent review, because the Labour Party decided to accept all the findings of the EHRC without any demur, without any complaint, without any challenge, without even any sort of commentary or any analysis or examination, as far as we know. So this very odd situation it now exists, in which there is a finding by an important public body with statutory powers that the Labour Party has committed unlawful acts of discrimination and harassment. And there's no challenge by the Labour Party itself. there's no analysis, there's no examination by any outside body. And yet, those findings, as the report which we're here to talk about, examines in detail, demonstrates that those findings are highly questionable. I mean, I would say they're plain wrong, but that's my personal opinion. And it's frankly disgraceful that the Labour Party has left the situation to exist in which these very serious findings, very serious accusations against the Labour Party, which have led to serious harm to a number of Labour Party members, several of whom have been suspended or expelled for questioning this process, are left in limbo. There is no accountability for these the situation, and you know there is potential damage to the Labour Party is very great. I mean, I'm a Labour Party member of over 60 years membership, and I am concerned at the reputation of the Labour Party and the effect of this kind of conduct by my party on the public, on the electability of the party, on the reputation of the party, and that is why, as our chairman today has said, this is an extremely important issue. Now, I don't want to go on any further. The detail of this report is very considerable. I obviously urge people to read it. The essence of it is that the essence of the issue is that the EHRC, for reasons which I can't explain, embarked on an investigation into alleged illegality, when the real issue here, and it's a legitimate issue, is whether the Labour Party's own internal procedures for investigating complaints of racism are adequate, and the EHRC could perfectly well have looked into that, could have made exactly the same recommendations which it has in fact now made, and which are the conclusion of this report, without embarking on the suggestion that the Labour Party has acted illegally. And of course, as I said before, it is this allegation of institutional racism and institutional anti-Semitism, illegality, which has been the message left by this report, and what the public now believes to be the case, that the Labour Party and its former leadership are anti-Semitic, racist, etc. And you know, that's, to my mind, there is very little justification in this report for those conclusions which are now widespread among the public. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. I'm going to pass now, although I think I have a little question in my own mind, and that is probably it's readily answered. You know, how do we get the Verso study? I assume it's going to be online and in bookshops if we're allowed to go to bookshops, which I think we are from now on. So I think its availability is important to see.
Can I answer that, Michael?
Yes, certainly do so straight away.
It's available as an ebook. It's published, I think, in the invitation, but it's certainly published. We can get it out on our JVL website. It's published as an ebook, not as a paper copy, on Verso's website.
Thank you. Thought just to break up the flow, I hope Daniel Finn, who is the next panelist speaker, he is the features editor of Jacobin and also an author. So Daniel, over to you. I have in mind, Liz, don't worry, you have to be away by 6:45. I think you'll make it.
Thank you, Michael. I want to talk in particular about the coverage of this report by the EHRC in the British media, both the coverage of the decision it made to carry out this inquiry into the Labour Party in the first place, and then the coverage of the report when it was eventually published last October, because I think the entire controversy about anti-Semitism and the British Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the modern history of the British media, and I don't mean that as a compliment. Nick Davies, the veteran Guardian reporter, wrote a book about 10 or 12 years ago called Flatter News, where he showed that a very large part of British media output consisted of what he called journalism, which is the practice of repeating claims made by others without doing any independent investigation or fact-checking of your own. And I think that could certainly be applied. Nick Davies, if he wanted to publish a new edition of that book, he could add an entire extra chapter about this ongoing controversy. When the EHRC announced that it was going to investigate the Labour Party, and right up until the publication of its report, there was a collective suspension of disbelief on the part of the British media. We were given to understand that the EHRC was really beyond reproach. It was a body that existed in a space above and beyond politics. For anyone to suggest that it was guided by considerations of political partiality when it decided to investigate the Labour Party was outrageous. It was guided only by the evidence, and the very fact that this inquiry was taking place was a damning indictment of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. And it did require that collective suspension of disbelief, because if this was true, if the EHRC was above and beyond political considerations, it would be a unique body in British public life. It is a body that is funded by the government, which gets its budget from the government, which has been slashed to less than a third of its previous level. Since the Tories came back to power in 2010, its chair and other commissioners are appointed by a government minister, and it would be quite remarkable under those circumstances if the EHRC managed to be entirely independent of political considerations and political bias, and indeed it is not. Before the inquiry into the Labour Party was announced, Harriet Harman, the Labour MP, who, as is well known, is no friend of the left of the party, no particular friend or ally of Jeremy Corbyn, she directly accused David Isaac of a conflict of interest when he was appointed as chair by Nicky Morgan, the Conservative minister, because his legal firm did so much work for the government. So that was an accusation that was made by Harriet Harman well before there was any question of the Commission investigating the Labour Party. In the period between the announcement of this investigation and the final publication of the report, there were a steady trickle of revelations. We learned, for example, that 2 commissioners said they had not been reappointed because they were too outspoken about racism. One of them was the only black member of the commission at the time. One of them was the only Muslim. Another commissioner, who was still in her post at the time when this investigation into the Labour Party was being carried out, turned out to be a donor and fundraiser for the Conservative Party, which she had not disclosed when she was appointed. Both of those stories were reported on by Newsweek, by a British-based reporter, but by an American publication rather than any British media outlet. 2 deeply newsworthy stories which were not picked up by the rest of the British media. There was this extraordinary discrepancy, really, where the choices made by the EHRC were immensely newsworthy and worthy of front-page media coverage, but the Commission itself was not worthy of any stories whatsoever. Above all, by the time the report came out, we had one glaring piece of evidence of its political partiality, the Commission's political partiality, which was the refusal to investigate the Conservative Party for racism. And let's remember that this was not some kind of nebulous plea that someone should look into the affairs of the Tory party on suspicion that they might have done something wrong. It was a specific allegation that was made by the Muslim Council of Britain that the Tories had created a hostile and discriminatory atmosphere for Muslims as members or potential members of their party through the actions of their leadership and their public representatives. And it was submitted to the EHRC with a lengthy dossier of documentation to back up this claim. On 3 occasions, the EHRC refused to make a decision about what to do about this dossier, twice before the 2019 general election and once afterwards in the spring of 2020. And finally, on the fourth time of asking, they announced that they were going to let the Conservative Party investigate itself, which is where things stand at the moment. There is absolutely no way that you can justify that double standard between the Labour and Conservative parties by reference to the evidence. You can only justify it by reference to explicitly racist criteria or by reference to political considerations. And the most simple explanation for why the EHRC refused to investigate the Tories but did investigate Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, it was much for the same reason that people who want to go on a sun holiday are more likely to go to Spain than to Scotland, because if you investigated the Tory party, you would be inviting a ferocious political backlash from the party itself, well entrenched in government, and from its allies in the media. And there was no such backlash when the EHRC decided to investigate Labour. So with that evidence already in mind, already in view by the time the report was published, it came as no particular surprise that the report itself seemed to be a rather artful document crafted with those political considerations in mind. On the one hand, as people have said before, and as I'm sure we'll hear more of later, the substantial empirical findings of the report came nowhere near substantiating the standard media narrative. And we should spell out what the core points of that standard media narrative were. Certainly from the summer of 2018 onwards, it was said that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn had become infested with anti-Semitism from top to bottom, that it affected a huge chunk of the party membership, that this was something that had happened very suddenly, very rapidly after Corbyn became leader. It wasn't an issue before 2015, but it became an issue not long afterwards. And that the Corbyn leadership was culpable at both ends for having attracted these odious people into the Labour Party, and then for having thwarted efforts to root them out through disciplinary action. This was not in any way marginal or a fringe claim in the wider media narrative. It was the absolute substance of it from the summer of 2018 onwards, and certainly in the way these issues were discussed during the 2019 British general election campaign. The empirical findings of the report suggest a very different picture. They are rather underwhelming and come nowhere near confirming the points that were taken as really sacred gospel by the greater part of the British media, including in the course of that election campaign. However, the conclusions that the EHRC draws are much stronger than the evidence would warrant. The interpretation of the evidence is stronger than the evidence itself would warrant. And there are many things that we can say on that point, but the most striking one for me is the finding of unlawful harassment that has been said already. It relies upon a rather tortuous chain of logic, beginning with the Labour MP Naz Shah. The EHRC refers to comments that Naz Shah made before she was an MP on social media, and asserts that these comments were against the law. It says that they were not protected by the European Convention on Human Rights and the right to free expression that is enshrined in that document, so they were unlawful. And in fact, they were so egregiously unlawful that Ken Livingstone in turn broke the law merely by defending Naz Shah in media comments in 2016. And then in the final link in this chain of logic, the Labour Party itself is collectively responsible for the actions of Ken Livingstone, and therefore the Labour Party broke the law, even though Ken Livingstone was suspended from the Labour Party almost immediately afterwards for other comments that he made in the same media appearances. So it all rests, as that would show, on the assertion that what Naz Shah was against what she had said on social media was against the law. And that assertion has no basis in law whatsoever. You don't require any legal expertise. It's an open and shut case. The EHRC quotes, for example, and says, Naz Shah appeared to compare Israel to Nazi Germany, which shows you how weak and how tendentious the case is. If they can't even say Naz Shah did compare Israel to Nazi Germany, you can imagine a judge in a court of law demanding to know, well, did she compare it to Nazi Germany or not? Saying that she appeared to compare Israel to Nazi Germany is a really extraordinary formulation in a public body with government enshrined statutory powers. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that she did compare Israel to Nazi Germany. There is no basis in British law or international law for saying that was illegal. We might very well say that it was in poor taste, that it was foolish, insensitive, inaccurate, that she was right to apologise. Shami Chakrabarty, in her report from 2016, strongly recommended that members of the Labour Party should avoid using analogies with Hitler and the Nazis and the Holocaust when talking about Israel. And I think that was very sensible advice. But she made it clear that it was advice, it was a recommendation. And she also said that she thought bad taste metaphors and analogies should never be a matter for the criminal law. I think she's right about that as well. In any case, they are not a matter for the criminal law, and there is no room for discussion on that. So the entire chain of logic collapses as soon as you go back to its original source. And there are other points in the report that match that description again. And it is really impossible on reading it closely to avoid the conclusion that the Commission started off, the people who produced the report started off with the desire to find the Labour Party guilty of breaking the law in some fashion and constructed the chain backwards from that point. I'll wrap up now by saying that there was a coda of sorts to the EHRC inquiry and report about a month afterwards, after the report was published, after Jeremy Corbyn was suspended by Keir Starmer from the Labour Party and denied the Labour whip for his comments in the aftermath. The Tory government appointed David Goodhart to be a member of the Commission. David Goodhart is a man who is one of the leading apologists in the British media for the hostile environment policy drawn up by the Tories in government, which, as the name suggests, is deliberately and directly intended to create a hostile, unpleasant atmosphere for immigrants and refugees in Britain, and which led directly to the Windrush scandal. David Goodhart's only response to the Windrush scandal was to say that it was an unfortunate accident, nobody was responsible, nobody could be blamed for it, and if anyone suggested otherwise, he considered that to be a form of political incivility, which was a threat to democracy in Britain. He said that the most important thing coming out of the Windrush scandal was to ensure that it did not lead to any diminution of the hostile environment policy, that it did not lead to any liberalisation of the British government's immigration policy, or to put it more directly, that it did not make life less unpleasant for immigrants and refugees in Britain. To have a man like that tasked with enforcing anti-discrimination law and equality and protecting minorities against discrimination is an extraordinary travesty, a joke in very poor taste. And yet the Tories knew exactly what they were doing when they appointed him, because the previous month, the leadership, the current leadership of the Labour Party and the liberal press had invested everything in the idea that the EHRC exists in this space above and beyond politics, and that you cannot accuse it of political partiality. The Tories knew exactly what they were doing, and you cannot challenge the appointment of people like David Goodhart or other people of similar disposition to bodies like the EHRC unless you go back to first principles and reject the assumption that the Commission is a body above politics. And that means going back and questioning, first of all, its decision to investigate the Labour Party, and then the conclusions that it reached.
Thank you. I'm pausing in case there's something else you wanted to add. Mayor, thank you very much, Daniel. And I'm going to pass straight away because of the pressure of time on Liz Fekete, who comes next. She's the director of the Institute of Race Relations and also has been an advisor to the European Commission against Racism and Intolerance. So Liz, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. I need to say from the outset that we come to this issue from a very different angle than Jewish Voice for Labour. As an educational charity, we don't have any involvement in the Labour Party. We aren't party political. Having said that, it's impossible for a charity that very much speaks to the anti-racist tradition in this country, to the principles of anti-racism forged in struggle by communities opposing racism, to not have an opinion on this issue. We gave evidence to the Chakrabarty inquiry because of that long history, for standing up for an anti-racism which is by nature international and compatible with free speech, for an anti-racism which is not punitive, which is not about punishing individuals, which is not about personalising racism, that distinguishes between personal attitudes and racist acts, between words that cause offence and words that are racist. This flawed report by the EHRC and indeed the Labour Party and other political parties, by failing to make these distinctions, have set back the anti-racist fight in this country considerably. I think the JVL report is brilliant, not only because of its defence of rational thought, but because of its clear and calm tone. It sets a benchmark for us all about how we should discuss these issues. It is educative. And if we are to educate against racism and anti-Semitism, we have to bring people along with us. And if we do that, we need to create an open and tolerant political culture, one in which we neither seek to give offence gratuitously or cancel each other out. I am very privileged to be on the same platform as so many wonderful speakers, but I would particularly like to pay tribute to Sir Geoffrey Bindman, who has done so much to create the equalities agenda in this country as part of a progressive agenda. And I think this is one of the things for me that stands at the centre of this discussion. We naturally think of equalities agenda and the anti-discrimination agenda as a progressive agenda. But what happens if that agenda becomes attached to a neoliberal government that actually would like to get rid of the Human Rights Act, would like to get rid of judicial review in order to establish new norms? And I think it's clear today that we are beginning to see an equalities agenda which is detached from progressive politics. We know that neoliberalism is about deregulation. It does not just apply to health and safety standards, to employment rights. It influences the approach of this government to equalities, where regulation to protect minority rights is seen as anathema to the free market. Equalities Minister Liz Truss has made no secret to her hostility of the whole concept of protected characteristics under the Equalities Act. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit sort of perhaps different from the other speakers. I do want to talk about the JVL report, but I want to see what implications the EHRC's report has on other minorities, for I believe its flawed logic is already travelling into other areas. So I need to give some context about what is happening today to indicate the EHRC line of travel. And there's simply not enough time for me to talk about some of these things in 10 minutes. So I put an article on our website, which I hope one of my colleagues will put on the chat, which is going to give you some more detail about the things that I'm going to talk about, which includes the Commission on Ethnic and Racial Disparities report, the EHRC's latest intervention in an anti-trans employment appeal tribunal, as well as the Windrush scandal and Goodhart's defence of white self-interest. I mentioned Liz Truss' attack on the concept of protected characteristics, and I'm also going to talk about parallels between the recent attacks on Black and brown people who use the term house Negro, parallels with the attacks on Jewish anti-Zionists. So I'm going to have to do this really, really quickly. The recent line of travel. You probably all noticed that there was a very highly controversial report, the Sewell report, the Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities set up by the government in response to Black Lives Matter. The EHRC was the only organisation in the UK with equality or human rights in its name to welcome that report. The report is highly stigmatising of Black Caribbean communities. It depicts Britain as a meritocracy and a global leader for majority white countries on diversity. And yet the EHRC welcomed it. The report recommended increasing EHRC's funding. But there is another recent action that we need to take note of, and that's its formal intervention at an employment appeal tribunal in a discrimination case taken by a woman whose contract was not reviewed because colleagues were upset by the climate created in the workplace by her anti-trans views. The EHRC has intervened in the appeal, and on its website it states that a gender critical belief that trans women are men and trans men are women is a philosophical belief protected under the Equality Act. I found it really interesting to see what they had to say on their website, because it goes on and on and on about how highly controversial and even offensive beliefs can be protected under the Equality Act. And yet none of these arguments were used in the investigation into the Labour Party. So part of my argument here is that they are coming too close to the government's line, to its attack on woke culture, to its culture wars. Equalities laws hold that beliefs can only be protected if they are compatible with human dignity and not in conflict with fundamental rights. But in the trans case, the EHRC could open the door for philosophical belief to be elevated over the protections of the rights and dignity of minority groups. I think this has the potential to set a new norm in relation to the dilution of legal protection for all minorities, and this is in line with the government's approach. Women and Equalities Minister Liz Truss, who oversees the EHRC, has made no secret of her hostility to protected characteristics. She says that equalities should be geared towards providing more choice and opportunities for individuals and promoting diversity of ideas rather than protected minority communities, she seems to believe. So neoliberal deregulation could influence our equalities regulator. The government seems to be saying, and I believe the EHRC are following this approach, ditch or dilute regulation which aims to protect the human dignity of marginalised groups and set up an equalities market where diverse groups and interests compete with each other. Now, how does this relate to the EU commissioners who are now in the driving seat? Dan quite mentioned David Goodhart, and I'll speak a little bit more about David Goodhart in a minute. We should also remember that Alistair Henderson, the EHR commissioner who led the investigation into the Labour Party, a barrister specialising in public law and human rights, has in the past acted for the government, supporting a discriminatory residence test for refugees' disability benefits, defending restrictions on legal aid for domestic violence victims, acting for soldiers accused of human rights violations in the Al-Swedi inquiry, and for the Metropolitan Police in the Leveson inquiry. As for new EHRC Commissioner David Goodhart, he might well be seeking to extend the EHRC's horizons as to which groups should be protected, philosophical beliefs should be protected under equalities law, given his endorsement of a paper by Eric Kaufman for Policy Exchange, arguing that white self-interest is a legitimate point of view that must be factored into the policy calculus. The EHRC's market-driven approach and the use to which it can now potentially be put to defend socially conservative ideas finds resonance in some of the methodological fallacies pointed out in JVL's critique of a Labour Party investigation. And I would just like to pick out a few things to mention. The whole issue of public concern. The JVL point out that the EHRC claimed that their investigation was undertaken because of high levels of public concern. Equality Act 2006 makes no mention of public concern being an investigator of an investigation. Public concern is a subjective concept open to media manipulation and moral panics. Read Stuart Hall. I want to compare this investigation to public concern over the Windrush scandal. The Labour Party investigation was a full Section 20 investigation under the Equality Act 2006. The Windrush investigation by the EHRC, taken after many, many years' delay, was a limited public sector equality duty assessment. The Home Office's policies towards the Windrush generation resulted in at least 180 people being wrongfully deported, at least 11 of whom died before November 2018, and at least 9 more before applying to the scheme. It was, in Sivanandan's important distinction, not so much about the racism that discriminates, but the racism that kills. And yet, even when the EHRC produced its long-delayed report, and even though it had the power to serve a compliance notice enforceable by the High Court requiring action, it did not do so, merely recommending that the Home Office agree an action plan. Now, I think JVL has mentioned the whole area, and Jenny mentioned this in her introduction about the whole question of Jewish stakeholders and the whole idea of a monolithic Jewish community. There are long-standing critiques, not least of organisations like Southall Black Sisters, of the impact on the minority within the minority when political parties and public bodies defer to communal spokesmen over issues pertaining to equality and human rights. The language of stakeholders is worrying, as a rights-based approach to the handling of complaints of discrimination is undermined when policies are drafted to stakeholder interests. The ERC has failed to acknowledge that discrimination can occur within as well as between communities. The report fails to clarify the law so that people have a clear understanding of rights and duties. And here we go back to the central problem, that the Labour Party have got caught up with the difficulty in today's media climate of balancing between the need to protect its members from anti-Semitism, while at the same time upholding freedom of expression around the Israel-Palestine conflict. That balance requires distinguishing between words that are clearly said with racist or anti-Semitic intent and words which may cause offence or discomfort, but are delivered without racist intent. Of course, people acting with anti-Semitic and malicious intent may use the word Jews and Zionists interchangeably, but many others do not. The Equality Act protects the Jewish community from discrimination, harassment and victimization related to or on the basis of protected characteristics of ethnicity and religion. But Zionism is a political belief, and if the EHR believes that it is part of Jewish ethnicity and that it should be given protection, that it must come out and say it openly. Instead, disturbingly, wittingly or unwittingly, deliberately or by default, it appears to accept that Zionism or strong support for Israel is an inherent part of Jewish ethnicity, and never ever even entertains the notion that Zionist belief is just one current within a very diverse community. Final points, and I'm sure I'm running out of time here, are the repercussions of this report for other minorities. And I've already indicated the Sewell report and the stigmatization and the further marginalization of Black Caribbean communities because of that report. But I believe that there are implications too, and I see parallels between the way that Jewish anti-Zionists have been marginalized and the way that Black and brown people, many working class people who use the term house Negro, have been marginalized. I've written about this recently in relation to the case of Aisha Kanon, from the director of the Race Trust, who was targeted by far-right trolls over the use of the term house Negro. She didn't even use the term herself. Somebody in her organization didn't even use the term himself, but made a comment in relation to Calvin Robinson from the Reclaim Party. For people like the Reclaim Party's Calvin Robinson, for whom colourblindness is the true anti-racism, to mention the person's colour is racist in and of itself, with those who use the term house Negro described as racists who have used the equivalent of the N-word. The word Negro is not interchangeable with the N-word. Was Langston Hughes a racist when he wrote "The Negro Speaks of Rivers"? Nor is the term house Negro racist, though it clearly causes offence and causes discomfort. Here we are back to the central issue again of distinguishing between racism and offence. In conclusion, the fight for anti-discrimination is, God, can't say that word. The fight for these laws to protect minorities has always been a part of the anti-racist fight and kept radical and progressive by the forces of grassroots mobilising. But today anti-racism is being delinked from progressive values and hooked up both to a punitive neoliberal system aimed at excluding those branded flawed individuals from political debate and to the marketisation of human rights protection for any groups who can claim its belief takes precedence over the human dignity of vulnerable minorities. By untethering the application of anti-discrimination laws from wider anti-racist principles and by effectively marketising equalities, the EHRC has established that it is part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Liz, and I gather that you will now, with minutes to spare, be leaving us, but thank you for your contribution. I'm going to turn to the last of the speakers before a slight break. There may be some others after it, and we'll have one of the questions that have been sent in. Peter Oborne is the last of this section, as it were. He's a well-known author of Assault on Truth. Well, with fake news everywhere, I think we're very familiar with that. And in fact, he sort of categorized it and characterized it as a new moral barbarism. I think nothing could be a truer definition. Peter.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, and very good timing, Michael. I'm going to talk about Islamophobia and the Tory party, because of course the EHRC decision to look into anti-Semitism and Labour was presumably a decision not to, or not at the same time, to look into the Conservative Party and Islamophobia. And I reckon that's a really interesting decision. I've been writing a lot, writing a lot of series of articles, mainly in Middle East Eye, about Conservative Party Islamophobia. And it's a very grave problem. It's not just a problem which exists within the Conservative Party itself, but what you can show is that what you can see evidence of is that it manifests itself in government policy. So it's not just a party matter now, it's because the Conservatives are in government and have been for some time. There have been some extraordinary, for instance, choices of people in really important jobs, like the reviewer of the Prevent strategy, a really sensitive thing, absolutely needs the assent of the Muslims, and they gave it to Willie Shawcross, who is on record as saying the most extraordinary examples, and he worked associated with the Henry Jackson Society, and that's quite an aggressive act. Also, the new counter-extremism kind of commissioner, or the acting one, that's another remarkable choice. And of course, the Trojan Horse affair, which is in Birmingham, in East Birmingham, where the lives of about 20 teachers were wrecked and their careers, and we now know that was not. There was the government investigations which led to that were based on false evidence, and that came from the Conservative Party. The Education Secretary at the time was Michael Gove. I do reckon, and indeed, of course, it's an interesting point which I've been making a little bit later, the EHRC wasn't concerned about any of that, not about Trojan Horse, which was really an attack on on Muslims in East Birmingham. It wasn't concerned, it hasn't made a murmur about the really wacky appointment, but very sinister at the same time, of Willie Shawcross to run Prevent. It's generally speaking been silent about the Conservative Party. Let's just go through. You can see the Conservative Party tilting towards really quite obscurantist Islamophobic discourse from about the last 7 or 8 years. Canary in the mine was when Saeed Abbasi resigned from the government at the time of the Gaza invasion in 2014. But it really got going in 2016 with the Zach Goldsmith's campaign to be Mayor of London, where it was based very largely on smearing, or very significantly on smearing, the Labour candidate Sadiq Khan as a Muslim extremist, or a man who was associated with Muslim extremists. The worst moment, which I really still find hard to believe ever happened, was when David Cameron, then Prime Minister, stood up on the floor of the House of Commons and named a imam in South London as being a IS, Islamic State supporter. I was watching PMQs. It was really quite astonishing. There was no evidence. I then researched the evidence. There wasn't any. Downing Street was almost impossible. It was impossible to deal with. It took a long time to get a proper apology. This was the nastiest political campaign, really, since that awful person Griffiths ran that racist campaign for the Conservatives in the early 60s, and there's been no comebacks, there's been no apologies. There's immense evidence of racist Islamophobic discourse among Conservative Party figures, including councillors and activists. Nadine Dorries, the health minister, is on, has retweeted Nick Robinson, and the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, uses words like, well, we know the wretched, the attacks on Muslim women, bank robbers, and all the rest of it, and he uses Islamophobic tropes and so you can see it at the level of discourse. You can see it also in the Tory supporting press, which is why they always tend to get away with it, whether it's not an issue. It's not, when you get a remarks of the kinds I've been citing, it just never becomes an issue. Nobody makes anything of it because the main press groups are simply, and Daniel Finn was talking about this, just aren't interested. And so it's quite a very, very sharp tilt towards a very ugly discourse, which is also manifesting itself in policy. And I think this is very serious. And we have had, I really don't understand why the EHRC doesn't say stuff about this. I thought I would have, I'm not a lawyer, but I would have thought it's within its remit. And yet when it finally made an announcement about that it wasn't right, it was happy not to have a investigation into Tory Islamophobia, they said the Tories were already investigating it. Well, the Tory announcement that it was going, press statement, had Islamophobia actually in quotation marks, as if it potentially didn't exist. And we now know that one of the three-man panel actually has argued that it doesn't exist. that's and EHRC has not. I sent an email to the press office of the EHRC. I said, "What's going on?" And they say, "No, it's all fine." Daniel Finn set out some of the links which have emerged between the EHRC and the Conservative Party, you can show them you can show and illustrate the double standards when poor old now Shah, who we're all discussing, sent out an inappropriate tweet or sent a bit. They came down on a ton of bricks, whereas when Nadine Dorries did the similar sort of thing by sending out a fake, they didn't rebuke her. So, and this is a pattern of conduct. And yet there is no question at all that there is a very grave problem of Tory party Islamophobia. And I would accuse the EHRC of double standards on two matters. One, on their conduct towards the Conservative Party in general, and it's not just over, by the way, Islamophobia, as you've just been hearing so eloquently. It's about anti-black racism as well, Windrush, and also a double standard with regard to a really big and extraordinary blind spot when it comes to the terrible racism of the Conservative Party. I mean, a YouGov poll of Tory members, I think it came up with the idea that the majority of Tory members entertain the conspiracy theory that large parts of Britain are governed by Sharia law. The majority, the evidence is terrible. It's there, it's on the record, it's demonstrable, and yet this is not a matter which it seems concern the EHRC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter.
And Michael, sorry, when you finish, I want to intervene for a moment to ask you about the questions, but you speak first.
Well, it's fine. No, what I was going to do at this point was, there have been questions sent in advance, and you let me see one that's been sent in, and I was going to deal with that question. Well, I'm not going to deal with it, but two of the speakers who have already spoken, I think, given the context and the contents of this question, there are two on the panel who are well equipped to answer it, I think, or at least give us a clue. Shall I do that and then you move on, or do you want to do something else?
That's a very good idea. Then we're going to bring in the other two speakers.
That's fine.
I've been sending you by WhatsApp.
I've got their names. Do you want me to announce them after the letter's been discussed?
After the question. But what I'm trying to say, Mike, because I've been trying to get hold of you by WhatsApp, I got a note of some other questions.
Okay, fine.
It's okay.
Well then, on the other questions, I apologize to the audience that we're discussing logistics in public, but we've had certain technical problems today. So when we finish with this one, we'll go to the other two speakers, and then at some point, Jenny will read out other questions which can be answered. So this is the question that I do have in front of me. Is there any evidence to suggest that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party might have been a promoted or sponsored campaign to undermine a leader and a possible prime minister who was a prominent champion of Palestinian rights? Or was it a coincidence that it suddenly became an issue when party membership increased under Jeremy Corbyn? Was there really an influx of anti-Semites? So I think, having listened to what's been said by Sir Geoffrey and Daniel, they seem to have touched on this already. So may I turn to them in that order? Geoffrey first and then Daniel, please.
Yes, well, that's a very good question. And it has concerned me for a long time that if you like, the main motivators of the allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party have been bodies which are in some cases led by avowed members of the Conservative Party. And one fact, I draw no inference from it, but I just give it to you as a fact. The former chair, until I think about 3 or 4 years ago, of the Jewish Leadership Council, which is closely linked to the Board of Deputies and which has been in the forefront of campaigning, having ceased to hold that office, became the treasurer of the Conservative Party and is now the treasurer of the Conservative Party. I believe he's, well, I won't give his name, but people can look it up if they want to. So that's one example. And I think also there is a strong political, certainly, presence on the right, if you like, in other organizations which have been campaigning for against the Labour Party, alleging anti-Semitism.
Thank you.
I'm just looking at the question again because I just want to see if it can be answered. It's saying, is there any evidence to suggest that the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party might have been promoted or sponsored by a campaign? I mean, you mentioned some figures, but is there any evidence to suggest that this happened, or is it
that
informed speculation?
That is evidence, if you like, that the former chair of an organisation which is closely involved in the campaign is now the treasurer of the Conservative Party. That's
so it's that link. All right. Yes.
That's one link. I mean, I dare say there are others, but I'm not sure.
Yes, fine. Daniel, do you have anything to add to this?
I think in terms of the way that the British political class and the British media functions, when you have a range of political actors who share the same goal, the same objective, you don't need to have some kind of orchestrated plan or orchestrated conspiracy. All that you need really is a kind of a convergence of interest and a convergence of ideology. And in this case, the basis for that convergence was hostility to Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, not hostility simply to Jeremy Corbyn as an individual, but to what he represented in political terms and to what his movement represented. And that hostility was felt by the Conservative Party above all, and by the right wing of the Labour Party, and by their respective allies in the media. And you could see from 2015 onwards, and particularly after the 2017 general election, there was a palpable grasping towards any argument, any line, any allegation that could be used to denigrate Corbyn and his supporters. So I believe that's the core behind this. I don't believe that there was ever a point when this campaign was primarily driven by people expressing genuine, deeply felt concerns about the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I don't believe there was ever really a campaign against anti-Semitism in Labour or in British politics. I believe that there was a campaign to present Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters as an anti-Semitic force, which is something very different, and that unfolded. And I won't go on too much, but I think one thing that is striking in hindsight, there was this sudden, surge of these allegations and this narrative that was gradually put in place after 2015. But there was a second surge in the character of the narrative in the summer of 2018. And it's striking looking back, if you read articles from 2015, 16, 17, there was a lot of talk about the Labour Party having a problem with anti-Semitism, but nobody was calling Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite. People were saying that he had a blind spot, that he was incompetent, various allegations which I don't think are well founded, but not the kind of direct defamatory claims about him that were made at a later stage. And the narrative escalation happened with extraordinary speed in the summer of 2018. You can date it to the day and to the week. It began with Margaret Hodge screaming abuse at Jeremy Corbyn. In the House of Commons, and within a few weeks, it was considered perfectly normal to have a statement put out saying that the Labour Party under Corbyn was an existential threat to Jewish life in Britain. And it was only a slight extension of that narrative during the 2019 general election campaign, when Simon Heffer claimed that Corbyn intended to reopen Auschwitz, which was just going that bit further than the narrative that everyone was hinting at. So yeah, I think the fundamental explanation for the fact that this narrative, which was demonstrably untrue in the key assertions that it made, took hold, was a question of demand rather than supply. And it was demand from the main forces that make up the British political mainstream, the Tory party, the Labour right, and their allies in the press were looking for points, attack points to use against Jeremy Corbyn. And that was how this narrative was able to snowball. And then it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating thing as well, because so many people in positions of influence and authority have invested a lot of political capital and invested some of their own reputation in supporting this narrative. So they can't back away from it without a very public loss of faith, or face rather. And that is why people have continued to double down. The more outlandish and the more implausible the allegations become, the more anxious people are to double down around them.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Now, I think unless I'm advised otherwise, I'm going to pass to two more speakers and then any other letters or discussion after that. The first is Naomi Wayne. May I call on you, assuming you are still with us?
I'm here.
Right, then it's your turn.
Well, I was asked to describe myself for your benefit, Michael, but you obviously don't have my description. And I said that I was the Chief Enforcement Officer of the Equal Opportunities Commission for Northern Ireland during a period when it was a passionate campaigning organisation. Now, this is a state body, it was a campaigning organisation. And a very successful one and a very legally competent one. I say that because listening to the earlier speakers, I've sort of rethought some of the things I was going to say. So I hope if I'm jumping about a bit, people will forgive me. I want to talk about a little bit of politics, but mostly I want to talk about some legal issues. But let me start with the EHRC itself. Various speakers have already commented on the presence of one member on the EHRC, on the Commission, who has very dubious views about race. I think it's interesting to look at the other members of the EHRC. Now, the Commission's predecessors were never particularly known for their campaigning zeal. But the EHRC is now structured to ensure its political enslavement. It's both starved of resources and denuded of commissioners from a grassroots campaigning background. Rather, the current commissioners are overwhelmingly important people who we've never heard of, who come especially from business and who've made a high-flying career in management and often specifically in what we call diversity. I have to say, when I came back to this country from Northern Ireland, I discovered diversity. I'd never heard of it before. I knew about equality, I knew about discrimination, I knew about equal opportunities, but diversity was new to me. And very sadly, diversity has taken over from what I was brought up on, which is equal opportunities and anti-discrimination. So there's a big problem that goes far wider than a single person or one or two people on the Commission. Its entire composition now is highly dubious. Nevertheless, I want to say something challenging, that even with members of a Commission that are not on the left, and certainly the Commission that I served in Northern Ireland was predominantly right-wing, it is perfectly possible to maintain a considerable independence and actually do some very courageous things. So, for example, at the height of the Troubles, we took the, for those Jews who don't, people here who aren't Jewish, you mightn't understand this, what I would describe as the completely mashugana Chief Constable of Northern Ireland and the RUC, we took them to the European Court and sued them for sex discrimination, which was regarded as an extremely controversial thing to do. Nobody ever stopped us doing anything we wanted to do by political pressure. My chair, who was a blue rinse Tory, but also what I'd describe as a Christabel Pankhurst type feminist, if there was any political pressure being put, it would have been put on her. And she never, ever, ever conveyed such pressure to, certainly not to her staff, certainly not to me. It can be possible to run a commission that's independent. You need a certain minimum of people on the commission who are willing to be independent and are willing to be courageous. And you also need a staff who are prepared to put up a fight. I'd want to say a personal thanks to Geoffrey Bindman, because the reason I was at the EOC as their chief enforcement officer, a major reason was because Geoffrey was on the interview panel, and I want to acknowledge that. So it can be done, and I don't think we should throw this idea away, because if we ever get another left government, I would like to see it as a priority that we campaign for a newly constructed, a reconstructed, a rethought, activist-led, representative and legally courageous anti-discrimination commission. We should not write it off. We should not say just because we have right-wing governments, they cannot be brave, they cannot do things. That's the first thing. Secondly, the commission was sort of, in its report on anti-Semitism, was sort of incoherent because it did some rather odd things. For example, I want to draw attention to a part of its report that seems to have passed our commentariat by. It's pretty much unqualified praise for Shami Chakrabarty's report on anti-Semitism. Now, anyone who remembers that report will remember that it was either excoriated, and Chakrabarty was described as a place person, essentially, or it was completely ignored. The EHRC pretty much said that if her recommendations had actually been acted on 5 years ago, they didn't say instead of being buried by the right-wing officers in the Labour Party, if her recommendations had been acted on, many of the problems that the Labour Party has had, which are undoubted in its procedures, would never have happened. So I think that is a very curious thing. So obviously the person who wrote that bit of the report wasn't quite on message. I want to turn to some specific legal issues. The EHRC was clearly under intolerable pressure. It would have been very hard for it to do nothing regarding the Labour Party. It had two options, basically. The first was to provide advice and support, as Geoffrey actually said in the introduction to the JVL report. And there it could have treated its legal framework flexibly. And it did that insofar as it talked about Chakrabarty's work. But the alternative was that it could do a competent legal investigatory job, i.e. applying the law. Essentially, the EHRC decided not to use the first approach, and it failed spectacularly on the second. In fact, from the moment it launched an investigation into, and I quote, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, it was pretty much doomed. Why? Now, I'm at danger of turning into a one-trick pony here, but I have to repeat over and over and over again, because the exercise was built on a concept with neither legal meaning nor even an agreed popular or academic understanding. After we now have three modern competing definitions of anti-Semitism, the IHRA, Nexus, which I'll bet most of you have not heard of, and the Jerusalem Declaration. The key thing is none have any legal status. Even if you, me, the Board of Deputies, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, thinks that a particular image is anti-Semitic, it still might not constitute evidence of a prohibited act and hence be unlawful under the Equality Act. And what we need to remember is that's the law the EHRC was supposed to be enforcing. Following this foundational problem, it was not surprising to see the Commission's joyful embrace of the Equality Act harassment clauses. And I want to say something very important here. These are frighteningly broad. Again, if we ever get another government which is left of this one, I think it should be our priority to take another look at those clauses, because they really are in the wrong hands, like the EHRC's, a serious threat to free speech. I don't, by the way, believe that was intended, but I certainly think that's their effect. It's also not surprising.
Can I draw your attention to the timing, Naomi,
Yep.
to the timing? Can you draw to it?
All right, I'll leave my final, I'm going to say
Go on.
one final thing, which is, what should our priority be now? Well, I think there is a priority that nobody here has mentioned. If we're talking at all about anti-Semitism, we should be talking about definitions, and we should be talking about the Jerusalem Declaration. I don't think we ever needed a definition on anti-Semitism, but that ship has sailed. We need one to see off the IHRA. And the Jerusalem Declaration, for all its limitations, is honourable and intellectually rigorous. It has also been totally buried by the media, government, political parties, and the Jewish establishment. We need to bring it out into the open and to fight for it. Sorry if I went over, Richard.
Don't apologise. They're very important issues, and I don't think anybody should be apologetic about taking a little bit longer than normal. The last speaker, although I'll be surprised, maybe there's another one I don't know about. Anyway, is Ammar Kazmi, and may I ask if Ammar's ready?
I am, yes.
Off you go.
Thank you very much, Michael. As we know, the EHRC report made absurd findings of both indirect discrimination and harassment by the Labour Party in respect of the party's handling of anti-Semitism complaints. Now, because those findings of unlawful conduct were made against the Labour Party rather than any particular individual, only the party had a legal statutory right in the Equality Act 2006 to appeal the EHRC's findings. But of course, by that time, Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner and David Evans had come to lead the Labour Party, and they obviously didn't exercise that right, I think, unsurprisingly. And I believe that if the party had done so, the report would have been substantially different and much more refined. And I don't think the EHRC would have been able to substantiate much of its monumentally flawed legal analysis. And I don't believe that any findings of unlawful conduct could have been sustained either. Now, it's reasonable to surmise that the EHRC knew that their report wouldn't be subject to an appeal because of the change in leadership, which gave them pretty much a carte blanche to say whatever they wanted. And so what we effectively had was a hostile leadership of the Labour Party colluding in a quasi-legal process designed to produce findings that could be used for political ends against the previous leadership and its supporters. So unfortunately, there is now no opportunity, as Sir Geoffrey Bindman QC mentioned in his forward to the report, to directly appeal the EHRC report. So the only mechanism that can be used now to challenge the report is a judicial review. And to my knowledge, there's only one judicial review, which is being brought by Ken Livingstone and Pam Bromley, who were both unfairly named in the report, and they filed papers in January earlier this year. And given that judicial review proceedings have to be brought within 3 months, and that time has now elapsed, obviously, the judicial review being brought by Ken and Pam is now the only case that ever can exist to directly scrutinise the EHRC report's legal analysis in a court of law. Now, of course, Ken and Pam can only challenge the parts of the report that pertain to them, but luckily for us, the legal analysis that they're challenging is probably the most pernicious of the entire report, which is the analysis on harassment law and on freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, I've already gone into detail on some of the most egregious legal flaws, which you can find in a article I wrote last year called Lawfare, McCarthyism and the EHRC. And indeed, this report by JVL also looks into many of those flaws in great detail, perhaps even in greater detail. So I'll explain instead the effects that the EHRC's legal analysis could now have, because this isn't just really about Ken and Pam. The effects of the EHRC's findings on harassment reach far, far wider, and they have the possibility to dramatically restrict people's freedom of expression all across Britain. And I think that was really always the aim. I mean, the EHRC investigation was a very British exercise in lawfare. It was triggered by two pro-Israel and Zionist groups, the Jewish Labour Movement and the self-styled Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. And so the EHRC was essentially, in my view, weaponized as a tool to conduct a political battle against anti-imperialists and supporters of Palestinian liberation inside the Labour Party. But in terms of the wider consequences, the EHRC's legal analysis could now mean, it's been suggested, that political parties, sports clubs, trade unions, as well as other organizations and workplaces will now be under intense pressure to take harsh preventative disciplinary action against their own office holders, staff and representatives who make even the mildest criticisms of Israel and Zionism. So in other words, the threshold for harassment, which, as has been mentioned, was established with reference to the thoroughly discredited and the highly politicized IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, has been set so low that people all across Britain are now at risk of being caught within the parameters of the EHRC's flawed legal analysis. So the stakes are very high, but we have the opportunity to strike a blow against the EHRC report in the courts. And I'll finish by saying that Ken and Pam's judicial review is still ongoing, and it's absolutely vital that people donate to and support that legal action. Ken and Pam are both being supported by the Left Legal Fighting Fund, which is a counter lawfare institution on the British left that seeks to support activists, whistleblowers and protesters. And you can find their crowdfund online. It's at www.fightingfund.org. And there's a specific page which is aptly named Ken and Pam. So please support that effort. It really is the last legal stand that can be made against this flawed and damaging report by the EHRC. Thank you.
I'm going to take this opportunity as chair to exercise a little bit of my own power to make a point that I think everybody watching should know. It is related to what you've just said, but not directly, only indirectly. And I'll put it in one sentence and be quick about it because there are others with questions related to the topic. I want to indicate to the public that judicial review is under threat as a way of challenging decisions by government and challenging government policy indirectly. You can't actually challenge the policy, but due process. And what this government and earlier ones want to do is to restrict its ambit. And that's what's going on at the moment, a so-called consultation exercise in which there's a risk that they will introduce ouster clauses to make sure that certain judicial review, it won't apply to the one you're just talking about. But I just want to alert everybody to the threat, to one of the last vestiges of power to the people in the sense of being able to, and of course there's no legal aid for this, so it's still only due to the few. However, I thought I'd just take this opportunity. May I pass myself back to Jenny if you've got some questions or discussion.
Thank you, Michael. I must say this is the most valuable evening. We've got a particular high level of expertise and a huge amount to absorb. I'm choosing two rather simple questions, which I think can be taken together. They're simple but very telling. I don't know whether people want their names read out if they give a question. Just in case they don't, I'm not going to give the names. The first such question, if people can jot them down, the speakers, is yes, the EHRC got it wrong, but what can we do about it? And the second, very linked one and very close to what many of our concerns is, Is Jeremy Corbyn's reputation now lost, or can this report be part of addressing an injustice? Shall I repeat them, or have people got them down? So the second one is Jeremy Corbyn's reputation now lost, or can this report be part of addressing an injustice? And the first one was, yes, the EHR got it wrong, but what can we do about it? And I think we're the elephant in the room, or the thing that we cannot be said enough, is that many of us have been damaged and continue to be damaged by the processes. And Amar and I worked together on another case, Labour Activists for Justice, where we deal with 8 people falsely accused of anti-Semitism. But the person who has had the worst of this, and perhaps almost the least deserved, of course, is Jeremy Corbyn himself. So I think those questions are very good. We may even have to finish on them. But Michael, I think as you chose Daniel and Geoffrey rightly for those other questions, maybe these ones could go to Peter Oborne first, and then maybe to Daniel.
Well, I don't really. All I'd say is that it is an injustice, and it's important to try and establish the truth. That's what I think. You have for a long time you get drowned out, actually, and nobody's interested, and there's a structural hostility to even listening to what you've got to say. But I've been absolutely fascinated to be here tonight because it's part of the education process, and I've been it's been absolutely absorbing, and we need to we've been learning about how injustice or falsehood is taken on legally, and it also, of course, has to be done through writing and through politics. So we should do all of that as best we can. I'm sorry, that's a very general answer.
Michael, I think it'd be sensible if all the people who've spoken have a quick comment on this. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, no, certainly, yes, absolutely.
Next, Daniel, are you there?
Yeah, I think in particular relation to the question about Jeremy Corbyn, because it does open up into the wider question of what can be done. I think that defending Corbyn's reputation against the really quite toxic slanders that have been directed against him, it's not primarily a question of vindicating one man, although Corbyn himself is perfectly entitled to defend his good name and to defend his reputation, and that shouldn't be subordinated to questions of supposed political expediency. I think that the statement that he came out with on the day that the EHRC report was published was both true and also politically sensible and politically sound, and it was the only thing that he could have said. But following on from what I was saying earlier about the fact that this campaign, it wasn't a freestanding phenomenon, it was really symptomatic of the desire of a broad political bloc, including the Tory party and the Labour right and their allies in the press, to push back against the surprising success of a left-wing Labour Party in the 2017 general election. I think by the same token, pushing back against this particular false narrative is going to be part of a wider reconstruction and recharging of the left after it's been knocked back in the last couple of years. And you do have something solid to build on. It's not a question of the clock being turned all the way back to 2015, because even in the 2019 general election, which went very badly for Labour, the Labour Party still swept the board with younger voters. I mean, people under the age of 45. I'm not just talking about students here. This was at a time when Labour was doing badly in general, but it still had solid support from that constituency. And I do believe that the concerted effort that's been made over the last year and a half to trash the reputation of Jeremy Corbyn as an individual and trash the entire movement behind him, and to say they weren't merely wrong-headed or foolish or ineffectual or incompetent or anything like that you might say. They were actively pernicious, and that they were the most pernicious political movement that has arisen in Britain or perhaps any West European country since 1945, completely detached from reality as it is, I think the virulence of that media narrative and media campaign, it reflects the fact that there was still a solid base for what Corbyn's movement was offering a year and a half ago, even at a very difficult time. And I expect that base to grow because the material conditions, the social conditions that it was responding to are not going away. You know, the problems of insecure work and low pay and inadequate housing and public services being cut to the bone. And the people who have supplanted Corbyn and his allies at the head of the Labour Party have no answers to that. The Conservative Party have no answers to that. So I expect the process of pushing back against this particular media campaign and media narrative is going to be part of a wider effort to revive the left in Britain and to get back towards winning some positive victories, which is going to be a long and difficult road, but it's the only way to do it.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to suggest something to Geoffrey Bindman in his reply, and then I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question at a popular request, which will be for the lawyers here, particularly Michael. So I'll hand over to you immediately. But I was going to suggest to Geoffrey, he and I were talking, I think it was yesterday. The Ford inquiry is not completely dead, and I think one of the things that, as Peter said, and I was really glad to hear him say it, a lot of the time I do talk about just getting truth back into the story. And I think it would be important for people to continue to write to the Ford inquiry. Geoffrey, do you want to say something about that?
Well, all I can say is that I believe the Ford inquiry could be a very important corrective to some of the things we've been hearing. If it's published now, there seems to be a serious obstacle imposed, as far as I can understand it, by the Labour Party itself, or by the leadership of the Labour Party, to the publication of a report, which could have a considerable bearing on the report we're discussing, on the EHRC report, because the EHRC report failed most notably in not taking into account the so-called leaked document prepared by officials of the Labour Party, giving a lot of information about the actual conduct of the investigations into complaints of anti-Semitism, and that there ought to be a widespread campaign, certainly among Labour members, for publication of the Ford report. There's no good reason for suppressing it, except a political one.
Thank you, Geoffrey. So I'm going to cheekily answer one question that was on the that's come through on WhatsApp, which is why I'm not able to keep you completely up to date, Michael. Immediately, somebody's asked about the advisory board. Well, there is now another Jewish Voice for Labour action, for which crowd justice funding has started yesterday, challenging the representation on the advisory board. So we're having a go from many angles to get the truth out there. Now, the question that I was going to suggest, Michael, if we can fit it in, is as I say, a legal question, which might Naomi Wayne, I think, might want to come in on. And it is, hold on 1 minute, please. Sorry. Yes. Again, I won't name the questioner. Haven't the EHRC and Alistair Henderson redefined political speech you disagree with as harassment? There seems no basis for this in the Equalities Act. And what people tend to do is to look at the Fraser case on this. I mean, do you want to say something about that, Naomi?
Yeah, I don't have the actual section of the Equality Act which deals with harassment, and in particular with speech that is objectionable, in front of me. But all you have to do is go onto the government website and read it, and you will see they didn't need to do any redefining. The actual formulation of that section is really very worrying. The only thing against it, however, is that there is legislation protecting free speech, and the EHRC gave very cavalier disregard to that legislation. But I don't think that anything's been redefined. I just think people haven't actually, apart from the Fraser case, people haven't looked that carefully at that particular clause. And Amar actually wants to say something about it, and he mentioned it earlier, and I'm going to defer to him on this. I want to say something about what people can do. The first thing people can do is read the JVL report. It's dense. It's not the easiest read. I thought it was gripping, but then I've got a little bit of skin in the game there. But it is really, really worth reading. It is very different from everything else that has been published on this issue. It takes the law seriously and it sets it in a political context. Second, get it out there, please get it out there. I think that's really important, that people should know that it exists. I just wanted to put those things in. This is actually now a political struggle because the Labour Party has walked away from challenging the report legally. There's only a few things that individuals can do, but there is a political struggle. Oh, and the final thing I want to say. All right, I'm finished. I'm stopped.
Amar a second, and then I was going back to Michael to hand to Amar. And I've got one thing.
Let Amar take over. He's going to.
Thank you. Yes, I would firstly agree with Naomi that actually the definition of harassment hasn't been redefined in law. And it's very important to stress the fact that the EHRC, whilst it's a statutory body, is not a court of law. It can't produce legally binding precedents. So the EHRC report in itself, whilst it could be said to be persuasive, I mean, it is a statutory regulator at the end of the day, it's not binding. And I think that because of that fact, because it's not binding, obviously there weren't, very qualified judges thoroughly assessing all of the material, and also because of the fact that they essentially knew, I think, and as I said before, I think it's fair to surmise that they knew the Labour Party would not challenge the report. They thought, well, they could just throw in a precedent here and a precedent there that didn't accord with equality law to loosely justify their legal analysis. So, for example, they talk about creating a hostile, degrading environment, and 3 other adjectives that don't come to mind, unfortunately. But there is ample case law on this that explains that those words should not be cheapened. They are very serious. They each have individual meanings. They can't be used as synonyms. But the EHRC just essentially throws that all together, quotes the Equality Act 2010 here, quotes a legal precedent there, and then says, well, this is our dog's dinner of legal analysis. And so one thing I'll just say, though, is that it's important to bear that in mind. They haven't redefined harassment law, but what's important is not necessarily what they have done, but what people think they have done. People think that the EHRC has created a new legal precedent. People think that this legal analysis is legally binding. And so that could have a very dangerous effect on workplaces and other employers that, as I say, will feel pressured because of the report to take preventative action against their own employees or whatever when complaints of anti-Semitism are made. And that won't even reach a court of law. So they'll be doing all of that, thinking that this is what is now expected because of the EHRC report, even though that isn't required in law, if that makes sense.
Out to close, I've just got information about 600 people are here.
Can I just, before you do close?
And I want to get Michael in. Sorry, who's talking? I can't see.
It's me, Michael.
Oh, Michael, so I wanted to bring you back in because there's one.
Oh, well, that's useful because I wanted to, I'm afraid, crash back in, if I may, because I'd like to, having listened very carefully tonight, and not strictly on the panel, but in relation to a sort of independent observation in a way, because this is why Haldane have done this today, to facilitate the defense of genuine free speech, which it has got its roots, well, actually in the English common law at the end of the day. I think the first point I'd make is, what can you do about it? Well, I think judicial review that Amar is persisting with is top of the league here for this, and I think we should lend as much support as possible. I'm a great supporter of this mechanism for ensuring some of the truth is exposed. So that's the first thing, support that. Second thing is, I think having been involved in lots of other situations where people have been under threat, it needs what you see on the streets of many places elsewhere in the world, and often here in London as well. And that is, you have to be prepared to speak the truth. You have to be prepared to not be kowtowed, not to be bullied by the way in which this particular exposition by the Commission has been misused by the media, as well as the actual findings themselves. And I'm going to make a suggestion. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm thinking about, because it's the question, what are you going to do about it? Well, besides speaking about it, we may not all get the platforms in order to do that, but I think it's time for there to be assembled a small panel of independent lawyers, and I don't normally want to promote lawyers all the time, but it is a legal issue of perception. A panel which looks at this report. You've got the Versa report. This is a good platform for now saying, right, this requires an independent investigator. The government aren't going to set it up. And I'm used to setting up things when I'm at the moment chairing the People's COVID inquiry, because Boris is, as usual, can't be trusted what he's saying. And I think in a sense, that's what has to happen here. It is in a sense, a citizen-backed, independent review by established, well-known lawyers. I'm not putting myself forward. I'm just saying there are lots of lawyers out there would be prepared to pass judgment on this. And we start to put this to bed. It'll take a long time, take a lot of courage. Just an idea.
So thank you very much. I think the last word is yours, Michael. I think we should let people go.
Oh, right, fine. I didn't mean it to be.
You could just reassure one person who asked a question, which is the EHRC's decisions, does it create precedent, is one of the questions.
No.
No, it doesn't. No.
Absolutely not.
And anybody else? I think we
except in the public mind.
Yes, that's the point.
Okay, apart from the fact it excludes other interested parties like me, Michael, it's a brilliant idea, the panel. And thank you very much.
Can I just say I strongly support Mike's suggestion.
Yeah, me too.
We should do something about it.
Yeah, good idea. Very good idea.
Oh, well, that's a good point to end then.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thank you for organising.
Thank you, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.